Now let's review the math questions for figuring out the impacts and the required amounts of government spending or taxation in the context of fiscal policy and the math that's involved. And these questions are 8, 9, and 10 on your final study review materials. It's also the same technique and formulas used to solve 11, 12, and 13 on that same review. So, here it reads in 8, if the goal is to achieve a total increase of $250 billion, that is $250 billion total in GDP, and MPE or MPC, for our class, remember we're treating them as the same thing, marginal propensity to consume or expend, is 0.75, meaning people spend 75 cents of every new dollar they receive. How much does the initial increase in government spending need to be? So you see the answer there, but let's walk through how we get to it. We have the first formula, A, so all of our needed formulas, the three formulas are there in blue, and A is the multiplier, 1 over 1 minus MPE, and our MPE is 0.75, so we see 1 over 1 minus 0.75, which is 1 over 0.25, and 0.25 goes 4 times into 1, therefore our multiplier is 4, meaning with that marginal propensity to expend, a new dollar that's created and used in the economy actually creates $4 in economic activity. As one person spends part of a dollar, they spend 75 cents of every new dollar, and the person who receives that 75 cents then takes 0.75 of that and spends it somewhere else, and so on and so forth, so that $1 actually creates $4 in economic activity. Now, to figure out how much government spending we need with that multiplier of 4 to achieve the goal of a $250 billion increase in GDP, X is our variable there for the change in spending, since we do not know what that would be, that change in spending. The multiplier, 4, we do know, equals 250. We solve for X by dividing both sides by 4, and 250 divided by 4 gives us 62.5. Therefore, government spending needs to be $62.5 billion. As that goes through the multiplier process, 4, it creates $250 billion in economic activity. In other words, increased GDP. Now, instead of government spending, how large of a tax decrease, and we want to circle decrease here because you need to decrease taxes in order to incent greater consumption, would be needed to achieve the same results? We see the answer there, but the way we get to this answer is our last formula, which is the change in spending, which was government spending, but here we're trying to incent a change in consumer spending, and then we set that equal to the tax change, in this case the tax reduction of we don't know actually, and our MPE is 0.75, we do know that. So we're trying to figure out, if we look down below at the formula, $62.5 billion. X, what does it take if people spend 75 cents of every dollar of X they receive, so that X equals, after it's multiplied times 0.75, of 62.5. We divide both sides by 0.75, and 62.5 divided by 0.75 gives us an X, or a tax cut, of $83.33 billion. People then spend 0.75 of that, in other words $62.5 billion, and that goes through the same multiplier process to create the same $250 billion increase in GDP. Remember, this is a simplification. There's certainly arguments between different sides on politics as to which is more effective, and this is a simplification of the argument for both, in that they both can create growth. Next, we go to 10 in the middle of the page, but we need to review that we use the information on 8 to come up with our multiplier. We use the information on 8 to come up with the size and spending change we needed to create a GDP increase of $250 billion. And then we still have the tax change formula, C, that we're going to need for this last question. This last question is to do a combination of those two policies, so a tax decrease and government spending increase, that would achieve the same goal. And remember that our government spending in the initial exercise, so let's go down to that first formula in red, was $62.5 billion. So let's just, split this right down the middle. Say the Democrats get half their way and the Republicans get half their way. And so half of the stimulus is going to come in the form of increased government spending. So we're just dividing that original change in spending figure by 2. That gives us 31.25. So that would be our increase in government spending that would go through the multiplier process of 4 and create, what would that be? About 105 billion dollars or 125, excuse me, $125 billion in increased GDP. And then next, we're going to need to figure out the size of the tax cut needed to, instead of generate government spending, but generate extra consumer spending. And the consumer spending we're trying to generate is what's not created by that government spending increase. So we're just taking the other half, the $31.25 billion. And we look down below the formula C that gives us the ability to figure out the size of a tax cut needed to achieve the same type of spending change. We take the other $31.25 billion that we want to achieve in increased consumption with, and we set that equal to X times how much people are going to spend of every new dollar, 0.75. We divide both sides by 0.75, and we find that 31.25 divided by 0.75 gives us 41.67. In other words, you need to cut taxes by $41.67 billion. People will spend 0.75 of that, which is $31.25 billion. That goes through the same multiplier process of 4 and creates $125 billion in increased GDP. That, with the government spending through its own multiplier process, creates the same increase of $250 billion. Please do the next set of problems, 11, 12, 13, and check your work by backwards checking it to see if the changes in spending and taxes lead to the change in consumption and or government spending that then lead to the same change in GDP.